I feel funny being introduced in South Bend. When I was in New Carlisle a few days ago, a lot of people were like, oh, she's from South Bend? Oh. But thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Can everybody hear me okay? I tend to, louder? Okay, and I'll try to use the mic when I can, but I usually will, you know. So just give me a thumbs up if I need to get louder, okay? Thank you. All right, I want to read you something that I just recently saw, and it's because in Phoenix, a lot of the people who contact me who want Holocaust speakers, they're going, well, we want a survivor, we want a survivor. And it's like, you know, our survivors are in their 90s or late 80s if they were young survivors. And, you know, they're not as mobile. I mean, I personally drive a couple who don't drive anymore to school functions. And if they sort of get a little bit off track, then I kind of jump in and pull them back, you know, and that's kind of my role as the Speakers Bureau chair. But, you know, we're working on trying to convince people why second generation and third generation of survivors need to be heard. And why it's just as good to hear their story. You know, you're not shaking hands with a survivor, but their story is definitely something where. So I wanted to read this to you because I saw it somewhere and I thought, it's really good. Each survivor has a poignant and unique story to tell of survival. By passing these stories on with their family and those who care about them, they make certain their story continues and the lessons of the Holocaust are not forgotten. Collectively, these stories tell the history of the Shoah, a history we must preserve and share. And while it doesn't say second generation or third generation, I feel it's very important. I loved the way it was worded because every survivor does have a different story, from being a partisan to being a hidden child. One of the survivors in my group, she was put in a convent, was taught to hate Jews, was very anti-Semitic, and when her father came to find her, the nuns made him buy her from them. And then she had to relearn that she was Jewish. Jews were not bad. So kind of interesting, you know, all the different things about that. So a little bit, excuse me. I hope I give you some information that you don't have about my mom or have not heard. And so a little bit about the timeline. So World War II was from September 1st, 1939 to September 2nd, 1945. Kristallnacht, which plays a big part in my mother's story, was September 9th and 10th of 1938. So my mother, when Kristallnacht happened, well, I'll back up even a little bit more. So my family in Germany, they lived in Hochstetten, got that? And that was in southern Germany, around near Stuttgart and Mannheim, that area, small town. But they were cattle brokers, so they bought the cattle from the farmers, sold it to the slaughterhouses. Well, Grandpa was one of the youngest kids, and his family lived in northern Germany. Grandma was the only child, and a girl, so God forbid she run a business, of the largest cattle brokers in southern Germany. So lo and behold, guess who got married? Grandma and Grandpa. The largest cattle broker firm in all of Germany was now combined. So Opa, who was my great-grandfather, so you'll hear me refer to Oma and Opa, and those are my great-grandparents. Opa and my grandfather ran this stockbroker thing. Well, Nazis didn't want anybody Jewish, you know, having a hold on the food source. I mean, beef, that was a major food source. So they started coming after my family much earlier than other people because of that. And I've had people say, oh, well, so your family was real rich and they could buy their way out of Germany. No, did not happen that way. They just kept taking away and taking away and taking away. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about my aunt. My aunt went to a school in a neighboring town. So I guess we'd almost call it a boarding school now. She lived there Monday through Friday, and then Grandpa would bring her back. So one day in school, the headmaster was in there teaching the class, and he said, Inga, I want you to stand up. She was the only Jewish kid in the class. So my aunt was about this tall. So she stood up, and he said, I want you to turn this way and that way and show everybody your nose. And she said, why? And he said, he's telling the class, this is what a Jew looks like. Look at her nose, look at her lips. That's how you know a Jew. And Inga was never a quiet, shy person, never. And she said, well, Herr, whatever his name was, what about Frau Schmidt? And he looked at her and she said, well, Frau Schmidt, she's got a nose like a beak. She's got a huge nose. Well, Frau Schmidt was the mayor's wife of that town. So, and obviously not Jewish. And so that didn't go over real well with the teacher at all. So he told Aunt Inga to pack up all her stuff and leave. And she started heading back to the place where she stayed during the week, walking. And about 5 minutes after she left, he allowed the whole class to leave, told them to go after Aunt Inga, throw rocks, bully her, push her, do whatever they wanted to do, but pay her back for having been, rude about Germany. So that was the last day of Aunt Inga's formal education in Germany. And she was probably about 12. Yes?
How much older was she than your mom?
4.5 years. Yeah. So Mom, I don't think, was going to school at that point. So she came back to Hochstetten, and don't know the exact date of that, but kind of the next big event that happened was Kristallnacht. And before this, Grandpa and Opa had, as we say, seen the writing on the wall and knew, the Nazis kept taking more and more of their business, and knew they needed to get out of Germany. And they kept applying for visas and applying and kept getting denied. So you've heard of the Kindertransport, right? So the Kindertransport that most of us know about was the one that went to Great Britain. And it was very well documented. They knew which kids were there, where they went, where they lived when they went to Great Britain. Mother and Aunt Inga were put on a much looser Kindertransport right after Kristallnacht, and they were sent to Sweden. So Sweden, being a neutral country, my grandparents and great-grandparents thought, they'll be safe there. So they did. They lived there about 18 months. Now, keep in mind, they came from a living situation where my great-grandparents lived in the house, my grandparents lived in the house, and the two girls. So it was a very close family, relationship. So Mother and Aunt Inga, excuse me, were sent on this Kindertransport to Sweden. Each one lived with a different family. They didn't see each other. They had no contact with the German family. They didn't know if they'd ever see their parents or grandparents again. That was about 18 months that they were that way. Mother was about 7 when she went there. Aunt Inga would have been about 11 or 12 at the time. So finally, Grandma and Grandpa and Oma and Opa got visas out of Germany. And so in March of 1940, they had contacted the families that had Aunt Inga and my mother and asked them to bring them to the dock. And when the ship docked, they were reunited. Now my mother, most of you know my mother, so my mother tells me, I wasn't going to speak German ever again. I mean, when Grandma tried to talk to her, she just said, and so Aunt Inga became her translator. And poor Grandma, and she always had the cutest accent, and I probably, don't do her justice with the accent, but she said, "My baby, my girl, she can't talk to me." And she said, "I cried and I cried," but Aunt Inga did the interpretation or translation for her. And of course, Mom picked up German again. I mean, that was just a mental block. But she remembers, and if you've seen the video, the documentary People Next Door, my mom talks about how the people in the area had circled the house and thrown rocks and done all kinds of things. And Grandma at that time, they were pretty well off in Germany, but they had a seamstress, so they had a sewing room, and they had a cook, and they had someone who cleaned, and things like that. So they hid in the sewing room, thinking if they broke the door down. Now, supposedly they did break the door down to the house. Some of this stuff is kind of sketchy, and anybody who has any counseling or psychology background, there's a lot to be said for trauma and how it shapes, your thinking. So I'm not saying any of the survivors I deal with, including my mother or my aunt, say things that are not true, but it's the way they remember them. And you all know Hugh. So Hugh Metzger was fastidious about facts. Don't say it happened on March 7th when it really happened on March 8th. That's wrong. So when they first got married, he had kind of a difficult time with Mom's story. And then Mom would get all worked up and upset and say, "You weren't there, I was, and that's what I remember." And I always remember her saying that. And I remember that when I'm dealing with other survivors that I meet, because it is what they remember, whether they heard about things happening when they were hiding in Sweden or Austria or whatever. It's what's in their head and what they remember, and that's part of their story. So I never dispute facts with a survivor. I think the only time I did was about the St. Louis, because he said that nobody survived on the St. Louis, and that was not true. So that we had to fix, but that's a fact you can, look up on Google and find out. So anyways, Hugh took that pretty hard, but the neat thing that happened is they knew they were not going to be allowed to bring money with them. So Grandpa and Opa had this bright idea. They took whatever they could of cash and bought jewels, diamonds and gold and, whatever they could find. And they had Oma and and my grandma cutting holes in a mattress because they were told that this crate was going to come to America with them. So they were going to put this mattress in there, and all these little pockets that they cut in and put jewels in were going to be there, and they'd be able to use that to convert to cash once they got to the US. So needless to say, that crate never made it to the US. Grandma used to kind of roll her eyes, and she said, "Oi, someone is schlafen on them diamonds and gold." So it was kind of cute that she remembered that, but Grandpa had wanted Grandma and Oma to sew it in the hems of their dresses. And Grandma was such a chicken about so many things that even on Halloween, we'd have to go over to her house because she said, "Them Halloweeners come and I'm afraid." So we'd have to go pass out candy for her. So to think of her putting jewels in the hem of her dress and going through a Nazi inspection, not going to happen. Thank God she didn't do it, because she was a very modest lady. She was strip searched. So was my great-grandmother, Oma, and my grandfather and my great-grandfather, Opa. They were strip searched in front of lots of people and each other. And even in the documentary, I think it's Abe Price that says something about, they made us be nude, and there were women there. There were women standing there. And so, you know, a modest time, not like today where girls are walking around with their bras showing and whatever else, half their tush. But, you know, she was very, very modest to the day she passed away. And she finally told me, you know, that story. And it was actually her time of the month also. And so that made it doubly humiliating to her. But the Nazis were all about dehumanization. Anything they could do to the Jewish people to make them feel beneath everything. They had them scrubbing sidewalks with brushes. Anything to keep them from thinking they have anything better over anybody else. I want to just add something about the family, because my family, our German side of the family, and that's my brother Brian, I think all of you know him, but our German side of the family, we're Germans forever. I mean, there's no need to do a genealogy. They were proud Germans, and I think they used to say, you know, how could our country turn against us just because of our religion? They were very, you know, very perplexed by that. And, you know, being proud Germans, it was like, how can this happen? So that's, I think, an important part, because I think we have Americans who feel that way. And, you know, they're American, and we're going to be an American. Now, Grandma, when she had been naturalized and got her citizenship, she had a little pin of a flag that she wore very proudly. And someone was talking to her and said, where are you from? And she said, why do you ask? And they said, well, because you have such a cute accent. And she said, accent? I don't have accent. She said, I'm American. See, my flag, you know. And it was just so cute because she had the cutest accent. And she would say, I went to the AMP on Saturday. And I'd say, Grandma, it's not gewent. It's either you went to the AMP or you gate to the AMP. She said, yeah, that's what I said. We went to the AMP and we did the grocery shopping. So that's just kind of a cute thing with our grandma. And our grandma was darling and wonderful. And unfortunately, Brian never got to meet our great-grandparents, because some of the people who lived in the neighborhood where they all lived remember my great-grandparents sitting on the porch, just kind of waving. They always made sure they were out there when the kids would be walking home from school, and they'd all yell, hi, Opa, hi, Oma, and they, hi, you know, that was the only English they knew was that. So I think I'm gonna advance this. Let's see if I do the right one. Oh, I should say that the reason why I called it a twist of fate, I don't like using the term lucky, because I'm not sure luck really plays a part. I think, you know, had they not been wealthy, and even if they were wealthy and like taking care of a bank, I mean, that would have been a different story than having a food source that the Nazis wanted. I mean, that's the fateful thing, is their business meant a lot to the Nazis, more than a bank. They needed to feed the soldiers, and they sure as hell didn't want, you know, Jews holding on to the food. So that's why I call it a twist of fate. Okay. Do I need to point it at you? We're getting there. There it is.
Perna, let me take a look at that, and I'll do your slides.
Okay, sounds good. Well, then I can't use the laser on here.
Let me see.
Okay. So I wanted to show you this. The middle picture is of Germany. And if you look, kind of to the lower left there, it says Stuttgart. Thank you. So right there is Stuttgart. Where Mom and her family lived was about right in here. It was called Hochstetten. You'll find it written many different ways, but the town was Hochstetten. This is a picture kind of more current of Hochstetten. And this picture is Oma and Opa sitting in the yard. And then this picture, this is Opa, Oma, Grandpa, my grandmother, and that's me. And this is Ian, who some of you may know, my brother Ian. And that was Oma and Opa's 60th wedding anniversary. So we had a little party for them. My grandparents had a home with my great-grandparents on Rose Street. So we were West Siders. And this is Oma and Opa at the apartment they had in Chicago with my grandparents. And this is them in the apartment. So the lady that's back here that you really can't see her face. So here's my mother. That's Birgit before many of you knew her, or maybe some of you did know her then. But that's my mother, Oma, Opa, Ian, me, Grandpa, Grandma, and then this lady. I don't know much about her except we were told to call her Tante Setchen. I wouldn't even be able to spell Setchen. I don't know how her name was spelled, but she came to visit us, and we have very few members of family on the German side. So I don't know even what happened to her because that was obviously a long time ago. And this little entry, 1939 and 40, that was from Aunt Inga's scrapbook. You know, she was a little older when she was in Sweden, and she made a scrapbook. So that was I think that was like one of the header pages, and it was when, the people she was with, that she lived with. And she was the age, got autographs, and you made scrapbooks. So that's kind of an introduction to my family if you didn't know them previously. Then I should do it? Oh, good, it worked. So we all know who that is. That beautiful woman is Brian and my mother. And she talks a little bit about Kristallnacht in there, and this is taken from the People Next Door. So, and Posey Tucker was the interviewer at that time. So on the top up here, that's Grandma and Grandpa. These are just some stock footage about Kristallnacht and destroying Jewish businesses. And Mom claims to vividly remember, all the burning and smelling smoke and all of that. So, let me go back one. Yep. Okay. It's not letting me change, Steve. I jumped ahead 2 of them. Now, shall I try it?
Next.
There, and there, and there. Okay. So this is a little bit, Mom experienced Kristallnacht at the age of 7. So for those of you who are grandparents and parents and can even remember when you might have been 7 years old, as we all were, the trauma of being torn from your family, the only family she knew and lived with, grandparents, great-grandparents, well, no, it would have been her grandparents and her parents and her sister, and, sent off to Sweden. She didn't know the Swedish language. She was a kid. So this is this picture is of Sweden. This picture is my Aunt Inga when she was about 11, 12 years old. I wish I had a picture of my mother at that time. We have no pictures of my mother from when she was a child. All of that disappeared. Had Aunt Inga not been the age she was when she lived in Sweden, we probably wouldn't even have this. But so that's a preteen picture of my Aunt Inga. And this is just the trains in Sweden. They were taken on a train. And I mean, they went by boat and then by train. And this is a picture, and this is kind of a stock footage of kinder transport kids. And they wore a sign like that, and the Swedish Red Cross and the British Red Cross were involved in homing these kids. Recently, I have been able to corroborate, because there's not much written about the Swedish kinder transport. So recently, I was able to corroborate the story and find out that what I was told and what I heard is very accurate. I met a lady who's a survivor. If you ever have a chance to see Passage to Sweden, it's a documentary, and it talks about Jews going to Sweden because of it being a neutral country. I have a survivor in Phoenix who went to Sweden to recover after surviving Auschwitz-Birkenau. And she spent time in Sweden just recovering. Lovely, beautiful woman. And so Risa, talks about Sweden when she goes out and visits students. But not a lot of people know about this kinder transport or, chunk the kids being sent to Sweden. So, but that's what the woman who was a producer for that documentary and a woman who lived in Sweden at that time. And she was Jewish. And she talks about, I was able to, they did a chat and I could put a question in there. And she corroborated the kinder transport to Sweden. She knew many families who had taken in, one Jewish child from Germany to help them. And a lot of those families were not Jewish. So that was the first time, that was only a few years ago that I had it, solidly corroborated. So let's see. Okay. So I don't know how many of you, I know you all know Hugh Metzger. This guy is Brian's and my dad. And his name is Harold Zubkoff. And this is Mom and my dad's wedding. This is my Aunt Inga and Uncle Sonny's wedding. Uncle Sonny was Irving Balin. So some of you who are longtime South Benders probably have heard the name Balin before, because his family was here for a long time. The bottom, there's me again. And then I'm going to tell you about this place. It's a store that was very much like a Gilbert's men's store. It was called Beitman and Wolf. We had cousins on the Wolf side. My great-grandparents' name was Wolf. My grandparents were Blumenthal. Of course, Grandma's maiden name was Wolf. So Beitman and Wolf had come to, members of those families came to the United States in the late 1800s. And they opened, this men's clothing store. And when Indiana had their centennial, it was still operating at that time, and they made a big thing about it. It was one of the longest continually operational retail stores in the state. So it's no longer there now. But
where was it?
Pardon? Oh, Wabash, Indiana. Yeah, that would be important, wouldn't it? Yeah. Thank you for asking me that. Yeah, Wabash, Indiana. So that's the reason why Mom and Aunt Inga and my grandparents and great-grandparents went to Wabash from Germany. So, not a huge Jewish population, but it was more of a, booming sort of town at that time. But they went to Wabash, and something that my mom, it had such an impact on her was when they got to Wabash, they put Mom and Aunt Inga, Mom turned 9 years old right after she got to Wabash. So a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old, they put them in kindergarten. And, Aunt Inga just looked at it as a challenge, because that's the way she was. My mother was humiliated She said, I was 9 years old and put in a kindergarten class. Can you imagine? Well, as they learned more English, then, they kept moving them up the grades. But she was just totally humiliated to have turned 9 and to be put in a kindergarten class. So as you can well imagine, my mother's put outness with that. So, but they did learn English, of course. They lived in Wabash for quite a while. Aunt Inga ended up graduating from Wabash High School. The Welsheimer Funeral Homes, the original Bill Welsheimer, his wife Ann had gone to high school with Aunt Inga in Wabash. So Aunt Inga then went on to Indiana University, and that's where she met my Uncle Sonny, who was from South Bend. At this point, Grandma, Grandpa, Oma, Opa, and my mother were living in Chicago. Very Jewish area of Chicago called Albany Park. And they lived there. Mom went to high school at Von Steuben High School and graduated from Von Steuben. So she then went on to the Chicago, totally lost it, wait a minute. Chicago Art Institute. How could I forget that? Just easy term. So she went to the Chicago Art Institute for training, and at that time, you didn't have pictures of fashions, in the newspaper. Someone drew them, and she worked as one of the fashion illustrators for Marshall Fields. So Marshall Fields had hired her, and she did fashion illustrating for them, and until she married my dad. But the way my dad and mom met was because Aunt Inga had met Uncle Sonny at IU, and she would come to South Bend for, dances and things. She knew my dad. She had my mother come in on the South Shore and meet them in South Bend when there was an event going on here in booming South Bend. And so that's how Mother got to know my dad. Originally, she was set up with Sam Balin. And if you know Sam Balin at all, he's probably about 6'3", and my mother was like here. So he was a big guy, yeah. So Sam Balin was Uncle Sonny's brother. And they were always in the fish business, something having to do with fish. So anyways, 1950 was a banner year because Aunt Inga got married February of 1950. Mother and Dad got married in March of 1950. So let's go to the next one. Okay, this is a conglomeration of a lot of pictures. So that's my little dog, Nando. I don't know why a friend of mine put Nando in there, but he's my best buddy. Let's start. This is Aunt Inga. And this is Aunt Inga and my mother. Aunt Inga developed Alzheimer's. Became pretty severe very quickly, but she lived like 8-9 years with Alzheimer's. Didn't know who I was for probably at least 7.5 years of that. And I was always like her daughter because she had no children. So for her to not know who I was pretty devastating and telling what was going on with her. I'll go down, let's see. This picture is Mom sitting with Aunt Inga at the home that I had Aunt Inga living in. And this was Mom and I kind of clowning around here. We were, I don't know where we were, at a restaurant or something. I think it was after somebody had said to Hugh that it was very nice of him to bring his mother to this restaurant. Not the right thing to say to my mom. So, yeah, so we kind of laughed about it. Here's another picture of Mom and I in her kitchen. And this one I like to show because 4 generations. Our family had many years of 4 generations. I had my great-grandmother, grandmother, mother, and me. for a very long time. Oma didn't pass away until I was about 12 years old. So, and then my daughter. So this one, this picture down here, there's Mom, there's me, this is my daughter, Julie, and this is my little granddaughter, Brooklyn, who is now 18 years old and in college. This picture, this is Mom, Aunt Inga, there's Hugh, that's my daughter, Julie, and her now 21-year married to him, but it was her boyfriend then when she graduated, I think, from ASU. And this is Grandpa, and I was the first grandchild and ended up being the only girl too. So this was Grandpa holding me in their house on Rose Street. And this was the guy that was the father of Aunt Inga's Swedish family. This is another graduation picture when my daughter graduated from ASU. This is Grandma and Grandpa at the apartment in Chicago. This picture, I was not here for this because I had just moved to Arizona and couldn't get back, but this is Mom's wedding to Hugh, 1981. So there's Mother, Grandma, and that's my brother Ian. Up here, these are people from the Swedish family. This I love. Hugh was so sweet and generous and brought my grandmother in to live with Mom and Hugh when they lived on Greenleaf until she passed away. And I mean, Grandma was the sweetest, nicest, most wonderful person in the whole world. And so having taken her in was just so wonderful. And she always wore that gold tie around her neck. When we buried her, I'm sorry Brian stepped out, but when we buried her, he was wearing the tie then. And he took it and ripped it off his neck and put it in there when we started putting dirt into the burial site. Because that Grandma always wore it. She always wore it. It has to be with her. So let's see, where are we? That's my mother. So we were celebrating Mom's 86th birthday. That was April 2017. She had just gotten out of rehab. She had had tons of heart work done and lots of rehabilitation, was gonna live a long and healthy life. And come early May, she fell, broke several ribs, developed aspiration pneumonia, and passed away in a week. I got her to the hospital on a Monday. She passed away the following Monday. So, you know, live each day to the fullest. Tell the people you love that you love them, because you never know what the next day is going to bring. But that was her 86th birthday. That was just another pretty picture of my beautiful mom. This one was Mom's 80th birthday. So there's Mom, that's Aunt Inga, there's Brian, there's Hugh, me, and then Ian's over here. So we celebrated it in Phoenix, and it was a really nice time. Let's see, there's me with Aunt Inga by herself. I had Passover Seder at my house. So this is Mom, Aunt Inga, that's my son Aaron over there, and the little squirt over here is my niece Kelsey. She's Ian's oldest, and she's an attorney in Phoenix. We have Zubkoff law now, so we're quite impressed. She does immigration law. So that's kind of, well, this was Aunt Inga and Mom, and at that point, Aunt Inga had started clenching up. Any of you who have had, you know, the unfortunate experience of watching, you know, loved ones, you know, get worse with Alzheimer's. We had to start putting things in her hands so she didn't hurt her hands, and, you know, it was awful. But she lived for quite a while with it. So, and I always, they were very competitive, my mother and my aunt, very. And I think a lot of it had to do with the separation in Sweden. It also came from, Aunt Inga was never able to have children. mother had, well, two for a long time, and then Brian came along. But we used to go places. We were not very financially comfortable, but Aunt Inga and Uncle Sonny were. So they would take me and we'd go to Florida during Aunt Inga's, she was a teacher during her school break in the winter. And we'd go to Florida, we'd stop and see Uncle Sonny's sister Idell and her family, and then we'd go to St. Petersburg and see his mother. Her name was Ella, Ella Balin. So that was the first time I ever saw grapefruit on a tree. I saw this grapefruit and Uncle Sonny lifted me up so I could pick it off, and he said, now we're gonna go eat it. I was like, what? You have to buy them at the store. I mean, I literally had never seen grapefruit on a tree before. So we did eat that grapefruit, and to this day I still love grapefruit. And Julie has 2 grapefruit trees in her yard, so it's always, yep, I'll get some, yeah. So that's a little bit of our history. And hopefully, I mean, one of the things I really like to share is, because people think maybe because they were wealthy is why they got out of Germany. Not the story. People think that they all got out together, you know, because of being wealthy. No, and my mother suffered a long time, 18 months without parents and a sister and her grandparents. Aunt Inga did too, and I shouldn't say really suffered. They lived comfortably with those families, but they weren't their family. They had no contact with each other or their parents or grandparents. So, you know, could you, I mean, all of the women here and the men, I mean, could you send your child away to be safe? I don't know that I could have done that. I mean, you know, logically in my mind, yes, I would want my daughters to be safe, and if we died, then at least they would be alive and carry on. But the difficulty of doing that is so hard to comprehend. But they did, and they had to do it. And luckily and fatefully, they finally got their visas to get out of Germany and picked up Mom and Aunt Inga at the dock in Sweden, had those families bring them there. They reunited on the ship and then came to the US and went to Wabash. So that's how everybody in my family ended up in Wabash. And I don't know if there's anybody in here that I'm related to on the Zubkoff side, but I know Terry Tolchinsky and I have a relationship somehow. And we're not sure, but I think my bubby Zubkoff, they were from Russia. They were from Kyiv, Ukraine. And so they came here in the very early 1900s. So Dad and Aunt Rose were the only 2 of the 4 children who were born in South Bend. So they're not, you know, Mom and Aunt Rose are not immigrants, but the 2 older kids have been immigrants from Russia. And they, you know, had to escape the pogroms in Russia. So, but Mom's story is a little closer to home. I'm going to share something about Hugh that I thought was kind of interesting. Hugh told me his family, I think it was his great-grandparents who came here from Germany. So by the time his parents were well-established people in Rochester, New York, they belonged to very reformed synagogues, and they kind of looked down at the immigrant Jewish people, similar to what, you know, we've been experiencing with the people coming from Latin American countries and Central American countries. But this Jewish people look down at immigrant Jews who came here as being, you know, poor beggars, and they're, you know, doing this and doing that, you know. I mean, I found that so hard to believe. And if you watch Ken Burns, the 3-parter about the Holocaust, I couldn't get past the first part because I was so angry by the end of it at what the United States knew and how little they did. And Hugh's family was a good example of that. They really looked down their nose at, you know, any immigrants coming during that time. So I thought it was kind of maybe karma, I don't know. Twist of fate, who knows? But who does Hugh end up marrying? Birgit Zubkoff, formerly Blumenthal, who was a Holocaust survivor. How is that for fate, right? The people they look down upon. And his mother loved my mom. She thought very highly of my mom. But when I'd heard that story, I just thought that was kind of funny. And then Hugh ends up marrying the Holocaust survivor. So that's kind of the story of them coming here. And let's see. I think you've all probably heard that Mom and Hugh met at Sinai's spaghetti dinner. Yep, well, if Karen Metzger-Luther were here, she'd tell you that wasn't really where they first met, that Hugh picked her up from a BBG event, and he saw my mom there and said, "Who's that beautiful woman?" And she said, "Well, that's Birgit Zubkoff. She's our, one of our advisors." So that supposedly is the first time he saw her. Then he kept hanging around the table at the spaghetti dinner, and Mom kept saying, "Do you clean your table this many times at home?" And he said, "Well, I don't have the same view I do that I did at home." So anyhow, the story goes on, and of course they got married in 1981 and lived, in a lovely home on Greenleaf, and my grandmother lived with them till her death. Brian was only 10 years old. And so Hugh was the father figure at the bar mitzvah and everything. So that's kind of, I know some of you like Steve, he had said, he thought Hugh was my father. And I said, no, he's my stepfather. So kind of, some of you know that story early, and some of you don't. So I'm just filling in the gaps if you needed some reminders about it. So I think that's most of what I wanted to share that I thought was maybe some things you didn't know about my mom. And so I wanted to tell you some of that story because I think it's somewhat unique. It's something I tell a lot in Phoenix, and I've had people, second generation like myself. I had one lady crying. And I said, were you crying when I was speaking? And she said, "Karen, I spent my whole life being jealous of my friends who had grandparents and great-grandparents." She said, "I didn't have grandparents." Her mother was a survivor. She said, "I never knew my grandparents. I never had great-grandparents. And you were lucky enough." So, and I know, I get goosebumps when I even think about it. I know how fortunate I was. I truly do, to have met them, known them, and known what wonderful, wonderful people they were. And recently I found some prayer books. They were in German and Hebrew, and they had been handed down to me. One of them, it turns out, is a Haggadah, which makes sense. They came in March of 1940. So they didn't know English, so they smuggled this Haggadah with them so that at least they could follow it in German, if not Hebrew. So they did that. And then another prayer book, we had a rabbi who speaks German in Phoenix, and she told me what these prayer books were. One is just a general, Siddur, but the other one was a prayer book for prayers for women, for daughters, aunts, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, all about brave women. And I thought, I never knew there was a prayer book like that. So I have those 3 prayer books, and we are in the process of hoping to build, well, we have $15 million now. Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the country, and the only one out of like the top 15 that have no Holocaust education center. So that's how I spend my retirement, is doing a lot of that. Okay, I guess if I wait too long, Steve, it won't go. Okay, so a little bit about the Speakers Bureau. I'm on the board of directors for Phoenix Holocaust. This presentation was used, in other venues, but the man on the left, looking at the picture, is an artist. You know, Tony the Tiger and the Pillsbury Doughboy? When he worked in advertising, he developed those ad campaigns. So he did quite well. He lived in Chicago. He lives in Phoenix now. He's 93 years old. And for the last probably 15 to 20 years, he's been doing what we call a life mask. And he does a plaster of Paris on survivors, and then takes it off, you know, forms it properly so you have a bust of that person while they're alive. And then he does the painting, and then we have someone who writes the storyboard to go with it. So one of the things we want to do is with this Holocaust Museum, there will be like half of the second floor is going to be all of Bob Sutz's art of the Holocaust survivors. The guy on the right is just a dear friend of mine who's not Jewish and is totally involved with all the Holocaust stuff. He says he lives for the survivors. Tony has done a lot and continues to do a lot, and is just a great guy. He's from Philadelphia or Pittsburgh originally. So he's involved in, you know, we have a Speakers Bureau. Like,
so how many survivors are there left in Phoenix? And how many masks?
Oh, he's probably got 75 masks.
You mean for people around the country?
No, people that have come to Phoenix and maybe aren't around anymore. He did one after death. And then, but the other ones were done while people were alive. So
this project's been going on for a while.
he has. It's been, you know, one of those from his heart. He's got a huge triptych that each piece is about, you know, the size of that's going to be put in the Holocaust Museum. There's 3 pieces of Holocaust scenes that he's done, and he's done them from hearing from survivors about things, and that's how he's painted them. So we're really proud of him, and we're, you know.
So how many survivors are there presently?
In Phoenix right now, I think we have about 15 that are somewhat active. There's probably about another 8. And we have a couple that we call snowbirds. I heard from one this morning. Werner is in Boston, the Massachusetts area right now for the summer. So he's looking forward to being back in October. So, but our goal as the Phoenix Holocaust Association is to serve our survivors. Make sure their stories are told. If they don't drive anymore, I pick them up and take them. And I'm always, my slide thing is always kind of on the teacher's thing too, because if the survivor starts drifting, then I might have to take over for a little while, you know, if I can't redirect them. But I truly feel that, you know, from the bottom of my heart, this is my legacy, is to carry on my family story. There's too many people who say it didn't happen. Grandma never talked about it until I was about 10 years old, and that nutcase at Northwestern University popped up and said it never happened. And Grandma was like, "But how can somebody say that?" I said, "Because some people truly believe it." She said, "Oh my God, how could they believe that?" So I said, "You need to talk about it, Grandma. You experienced it." And that just opened up the floodgates. So, which was great, because I heard a lot about it then. And from her point of view. Yes?
Karen, I wondered, how did your grandparents and great-grandparents leave? Were you all in the same family together?
Yes, they lived in the same house, because Grandma and Grandpa had been an arranged marriage to bring that cattle broker business together. And so they lived in the same house with Mom and Aunt Inga.
Leave
Germany?
Holocaust to come to America.
They finally got visas and they took a ship. And the ship docked in Sweden, and they could have the Swedish families bring Mom and Aunt Inga to the ship so they would reunite. Yes?
So, to the extent that you know about it, can you explain this kinder transport that went from Germany to Sweden? Who was that the joint, was that the joint, was that Jewish aid team? I mean, who actually, within the
Organized it?
Jewish world, set that up, and how did that
You
all
know,
come
you know, I don't truly know. It's just, you know, it was well known that Sweden was a neutral country. And
And then within Sweden, do you have any idea of how they found, were these the families that they were placed with?
oh, they just asked in the different
Were
towns.
they simply, were they being paid like you would think
No.
with foster kids?
No,
So were they Jewish? Were they?
most of them were not Jewish. That, I found that out when I corroborated all this about a year ago. Most of the families were not Jewish. The woman I talked to was Jewish, but she knew of other families who had taken in a German child, you know, temporarily, and no, they received no funding, which is why we think Mom and Aunt Inga were in different families.
And did your mom or your aunt talk at all about their day-to-day life during the?
Aunt Inga did. Mom didn't say much, but Aunt Inga enjoyed it in Sweden. I mean, she was very academic. I mean, Aunt Inga had 2 master's degrees and spoke like 6 languages. So she was you know, very, very academic. And my mom was creative and Aunt Inga was academic. And so she loved it because she was back in school. She was in her element. So she was very happy to be in school.
We can't hear you, Karen.
How your family ended up in Wabash?
How they ended up in Wabash? It was that store, Beitman and Wolf. We had the Wolf side of the family. Some members of it had gone to Wabash, like in the late 1800s. And they had like a supermarket, and then they opened up this clothing store. And then the Beitmans somehow with that. There was a like intermarriage, like a Wolf married a Beitman and, you know, something like that. And so they combined, and that's when the store became known Beitman and Wolf. And it was very much like a Gilbert's. And so they sponsored, because at that time you could not come to this country unless somebody sponsored you and said, we will pay and take care of everything. This family will not need anything because we will sponsor them. And yes.
Do you have any contact with people in Wabash now? Have you spoken to?
Well, I took Brian about 2 years ago, and we went to Wabash to go to the cemetery because Oma and Opa and Grandpa are buried in that cemetery. So I hadn't been there since Grandma had passed away. So we went back, and of course, I remembered the cemetery being like Hebrew Orthodox. Instead, it's more like half of this room. I was like, this isn't the same cemetery. But of course it was, from a child's viewpoint, it was huge at the time. But they were buried there because when they first came, one of the things they did was make sure they had plots there because they were Americans now. And I don't think they anticipated leaving Wabash and going to Chicago, but Grandma and Grandpa felt that the job opportunities were better for them in Chicago. And so once Aunt Inga had finished high school and gone to Indiana University, they felt comfortable enough to leave Wabash. So that's when that happened. 4 years later, Mom went on to the Art Institute and then worked there. And then after the marriages happened, then Grandma, Grandpa, Oma, and Opa moved to South Bend on Rose Street because I was born. So 1950 is when both the ladies got married. And I was born in 52, and that's about when Grandma and Grandpa and Oma and Opa moved here. So, and I think I told you, one of the gals who was at the New Carlisle thing said to me, well, did you live at your grandparents' house? And I, no, but we lived somewhat close to there. So I spent a lot of time there. And, you know, a cadre of friends at my house, a cadre of friends down at Grandma's house. So this gal came up to me and introduced herself, and she was one of my friends when I was at Grandma's house. And she said, I always remember your grandparents sitting on the porch, waving at us when we were coming home from school. And I showed her a picture, and she said, yeah, it was Oma and Opa, who didn't speak it. And Opa wore like a cardigan sweater that he'd have all buttoned, and he had little pockets on the side. He always had candy in it. And if any of the kids came up to the porch, then he would give them candy. But every kid in that area called him Oma and Opa. Nobody knew him by anything else. So, but she thought those were my grandparents and not just my great-grandparents. Jerry.
I don't know if you remember Patty Myers from BBYO. She grew up in Fort Wayne. She was a niece of Dorothy Schiller's. But I think she married a gentleman in Wabash. And maybe he was.
What was her first name?
Patty or
Patrice Sposeep.
Yes.
Yes, Patrice and Mike Sposeep.
Wasn't he the mayor there or something?
No, he was a lawyer and a judge, and he was like the head judge of the county. So his name was Michael Sposeep, and they lived in Wabash. Now, I saw Sposeep gravestones too in that cemetery. And they now live in Scottsdale. So small world, small world. I got to meet them. And when I was coming back and I wanted to go to the cemetery, I didn't know if it would be closed on a Saturday. I wasn't sure what the rules were. I knew what we do at Hebrew Orthodox. And so I called him and asked. And he said, no, it's just always open. So we were able to go there and see. And we went to the Historical Society in Wabash also. And as soon as they knew Beitman and Wolf was our connection, they were going, oh, you know, it was like we were royalty, because.
Is there was there a congregation actually in Wabash?
For a short time, there was a congregation in Wabash. I'm trying to remember the name of the, I can't remember the name of the cemetery, but it was like Rosh Hodesh or something like that, or Rodesh.
So there was more than just.
Not many. Yeah, not a lot, but there were some, yes. Yes.
So we've got a few questions from Zoom.
Oh, okay.
First one is from Sharon. She asks if you can talk more about Kristallnacht and how it impacted directly and indirectly your mom and family.
Okay, so Kristallnacht was the beginning of when they saw the violence. And that is what really got the wheels going for my grandparents to decide that the girls would have to be sent somewhere else to be saved. If grandparents and great-grandparents couldn't get out of Germany, at least they knew that the girls would be in a safe place and would grow up to adults. So the impact was the turning point. You know, it's really happening, we gotta go. And the people had circled, during Kristallnacht, people had circled the house where they all lived and were yelling dirty Jew and go home and get out. And Mom had pointed out, she said, but that's Hilda and that's my friend. She couldn't, why are they yelling at us? And she says she was screaming and nobody would help her. So, but that was a turning point. Kristallnacht, so that was November 9th and 10th of 1938.
Another question. Do you recall, this one from Judy Wine, do you recall how your family obtained the visas to get out of Germany?
Yeah, for some reason, I don't think the kids needed them to get out, but the adults needed them. And they just kept applying, and they kept being denied constantly. And Grandpa would have to go to, to Berlin or someplace and keep applying. But they were constantly denied, and they didn't think they were going to ever get out. Grandpa and Opa were actually taken to what Grandpa told me was a holding camp. And they had rounded up a lot of men in the Hofstetten area that they felt were Jewish or were Jewish sympathizers and put them in this holding camp. And someone released them all. You know, it's kind of loosely passed on story, but it wasn't an actual concentration camp, although the next step would have been a concentration camp. Are there any more, Steve? Nope.
We have about 5 more minutes to get things wrapped up.
Okay, okay. Are there any more questions? No. Well, I thank you all for coming, and those of you on Zoom, thank you for being on. I'm going to wave at you. If I turn around, you won't see me, so.
I have one quick question.
Sure.
Do you also speak to young adults?
Yes.
High school students and elementary age classes?
Yes, not so much elementary. In Arizona, we start about 5th grade through high school. And we recently passed a statute where Holocaust and genocide education has to be taught twice between 5th grade and 12th grade. And because when that was passed, a lot of people had done it in high school, but they hadn't done it much in the middle school years. So I've been deluged with middle school teachers who have never had to teach it before. So it's like, yay! Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, I was talking to Karen before the presentation. You said you were speaking up in New Carlisle. You had an invitation to speak up there, and you had mentioned that we have a robust Holocaust Education Speakers Bureau here. Bob just mentioned that New Carlisle is only, what, about 30 minutes away?
Oh, yeah.
I hope that we can certainly meet their needs up there, and we look forward to getting invite.
There was a teacher there who did show it at New Prairie High School.
Okay.
And I got a letter from her, from the mother of a child who said he was so moved by the documentary that he wrote an essay and won a prize.
Well, that is wonderful, and I'll mention to you, this past year, we had a very robust Holocaust Education Speakers Bureau. We had over 60 presentations in the school classrooms at the middle school and high school level. So if you know an opportunity, Mr. Bob Pfefferman is in the back there. Let Bob know, and we'd certainly like to take advantage of all the opportunities that we have here in the area.
And I can do things on Zoom.
And you can do, okay, very good.
So,
well, let's put our hands together once again for Karen.
thank you.
Thank you for coming. Have a blessed rest of your day, a safe day. We'll see you soon.
Do you know Byron Joel is?